In cycling, just like in most activities in life, we've got our milestones. In cycling, the milestone is called riding a century. A century is where you ride your bike for 100 miles in one day, continuously, with some breaks thrown in here and there for good measure. A lot of people compare riding the century to being able to run a marathon. I think running the marathon is a little bit more challenging, requires a little bit more training and specialization, but nonetheless, riding the centuries are a big deal. But just like with a marathon, you can run it well or you can run it poorly. You can ride a century well or you can ride it poorly. Today, we're going to talk about how to ride a century well.
Now, I do believe a century is and should be a goal for anyone who would like to accomplish it. But I believe that it should be done well. And by well, I mean that you understand enough about your cycling body and you understand enough about the sport to be able to enjoy the experience, barring flats and unwarranted stops or unpredictable weather. A group century that is properly paced can be accomplished in 5 to maybe 6.5 hours, especially if it's done over flat-ish terrain, with someone who has diligently worked on increasing their mileage and has a good understanding of what works right for them regarding fitness level and nutrition. If we're talking about a hilly century, those should be accomplished in about 6 to maybe 7.5 hours. And by hilly, I'm talking about not too hilly, but lumpy, maybe something with less than about 3,000 feet of elevation.
I'm only one step ahead of heartbreak, one step ahead of misery, one step is all I have to take backwards to be the same old fool for you I used to be.
So if you're considering doing a century, here are a few goals or milestones that I would focus on accomplishing. First one being becoming a better cyclist. Just some simple steps to that. Number one, making sure that you have a proper bike fit, which includes making sure that the saddle that you're using fits your sit bones properly. Next is using proper cycling attire, not just because of the look, but also because of the aerodynamic benefits and the moisture wicking and comfort and convenient reasons behind it. Next is to make sure that you're riding the bike properly, making sure that your pedaling efficiency is on point, being able to slide forward in the saddle and spin, being able to sit back in the saddle and grind, making sure that you have a very smooth and efficient pedaling stroke. Learning how to corner properly saves you a lot of time and a lot of effort if you're able to do that properly. Being able to hold the wheel, being able to draft, and being able to ride in the pace line, especially if you're riding with a group or you're attempting to do the century with a few friends. Next is learning how to save your hands, the importance of being able to move your hands from the hoods to the tops to the drops if you're using a drop bar bike. Saving your hands is a huge deal. Next is being able to drink and eat while on the bike. I see a lot of people who are new to the sport who simply are not comfortable reaching down, grabbing the water bottle, or reaching into their back jersey pocket and grabbing a snack or a gel. It will save you a lot of time if you're able to comfortably eat and drink while you're riding. Not to mention, if you're able to do it properly, there's a lot of safety benefits that goes along with that. Next thing to consider, how are you eating? What is your nutrition plan? Not your buddy's, what is yours? You've got to figure out what works for you. For example, have you figured out what works for you on, let's say, a 60-mile ride that keeps you from bonking or stopping every 10 minutes with 10 miles to go? You got to understand that most people respond differently to nutrition. For example, on a big ride, I can carb load on pasta the night before. I'll also drink a gallon of water the day before, On the morning of the event, I'll get up, I'll have a cup of coffee, oatmeal, maybe 2 scrambled eggs, and I'll typically do this about an hour before I actually get on a ride. When the ride starts, I'll have a banana as I pedal off. From there, I can follow my normal interval of hydration, which would be a bottle about every hour and a gel every 30 miles. For centuries, peanut butter and jelly sandwich and half a banana at the 60-mile mark and at the 80 to 90-mile mark to go. That usually gets me through it. But that's what works for me. You've got to figure out in this situation what works for you. So next, let's talk about fitness. How fit are you? Now, if we're talking about being able to do the century, as I mentioned, a flat century in about 5 to 6.5 hours, we've got to ramp up to that, right? One of the first things that I would recommend you focus on doing and being able to do well, 20-mile ride, where your ride pace is between 17 and 20 miles an hour. Not your average speed, but your ride pace. And not necessarily, as I mentioned, doing that solo. Maybe you're riding with a group or you're riding with 2 or 3 friends where you guys are riding in a pace line and you're sharing the work. After you've done 20 miles at that pace, then attempt to do 40 miles and work up to where you can do 40 miles at that pace. After you've done 40 miles at that pace, focus on getting to where you can do 60 miles at that pace, which is just about a metric century. Once you've done that, your next goal should be to try to complete 75 miles in about 4 to 5 hours. If you can ride 75 miles, you can ride a century. The neat thing about being able to ride 75 miles in 4 to 5 hours without feeling like you're going to pass out when you get off the bike is that now you're starting to condition your body for the effort of riding a century. One of the things to realize about riding a century is that it's not the first 60 miles that gets you, it's the last 40.
Wow, man. Bro, let me tell you about it. Yo, and she came with the same type game, the type of girl giving out the fake cell phone, the name Big Fame. She like catching big things, jewel ship, money clip, phone flip the 6 range.
Next, how to mentally approach a century. Now you can go into it thinking, I'm going to ride my bike 100 miles today, and that's perfectly fine. One of my approaches to riding a century is that I break it up into segments. I have done centuries where I broke it up into 34 miles, 33 miles, 33 miles. Or you can do 40 miles, 30 miles, 30 miles. The other approach is to do 30, 30, 30, and let the last 10 miles be a dogfight. One of the things that I've found is that it's beneficial to break it up into smaller sections because at some point your century is going to become a mental battle. When I lived in Georgia, there's a road, a loop that I had that I used to train on. I used to ride on, I didn't train, that I used to ride on that was a 10-mile loop. It was called a Robinson Road Loop. And whenever I was in any type of ride, I was trying to accomplish any type of goal, and I was thinking, oh man, I have 50 miles to go. I would think to myself, instead of thinking, I've got 50 miles to go, I would think, I've got to do 5 loops of Robinson Road. I cannot tell you the amount of times that that little mental game has saved me. To this day, I still play that game with my head. If I need to break it down into 10-mile chunks, I've got no shame in going back to my Robinson Road loop. 10 miles gets it done. Mental gymnastics is one of the things that are very essential, very important in you being able to accomplish this task. And last but not least, we've got to talk about rest. Did you rest? Don't attempt a century after a rough week at work. Don't attempt a century after a binge night out with your friends. Make sure that you're well rested. As I mentioned before, make sure that you have your nutrition plan down pat. But make sure that you're in a calm state of mind, that you're not thinking or worrying about the 50 million things that you've got to do when you get back home, or you're thinking about all the stresses and things like that that you have on your job. All of those things will basically take you out of the game mentally. Be relaxed, plan ahead, Make sure that you're well rested. Make sure that you have a clear mind so that you could effectively focus and execute whatever your game plan is. And as I said, if you just focus on doing some of these things, you'll ride a century well. Thanks again for tuning in to the channel, guys. Any comments or share your century experience with me, please drop a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear some of the feedback that people have about their first, their failure, or their successful attempt at doing a century. As always, guys, our aim is to inform, instruct, inspire. Thanks again for tuning in. Be blessed.